I want everybody to meet Alex today. Alex studied a mix of life sciences, philosophy, and math at University of Michigan. Alex, you worked also as chief of staff of engineering for a software company before becoming obsessed about the problem of enteric methane. So you're going to tell us all about that. And I think you share with Mark the passion for surfing, but also soccer and chess when you're not working on biology. So welcome. We're so appreciative for you to make the time to talk to this group today and share more about what you're doing at Alga Biosciences. I wanted to share a quick photo and then we'll stop with slides about the product, so you can tell us more. And some numbers, I feel like methane has been a bit more top of mind and in the news lately, and maybe with COP29, what was also on the topic. But if you're not familiar, methane is actually really, really impactful because it has a warming potential about 87x the one of CO2. It's shorter lifetime, life impact. It's more 20 years, but it's very, very strong. And today we're going to talk a lot about cattle. That's why we started our little icebreaker around them. But they account for 27% of the US annual methane emissions, so something pretty significant. And that's the origin of your company. Alex, let's jump in. Again, welcome. And I think, a lot of people in this group are also interested in startups. So wanted to just go back a little bit and understand your personal founder journey, how you decided to build Alga Biosciences.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me to start. And I think a lot of where this came from was the problem of understanding the value of methane. And it was something that I believed was really done, kind of misunderstood in a lot of the policymaking and climate, BC community, where I know some of you are familiar with this, but just to get on my soapbox quickly, methane and CO2 are just like fundamentally different gases. CO2 warms the planet and stays in the atmosphere essentially forever. So we're emitting a lot of CO2 every year, and our levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are too high. So we're too high, and every year it keeps increasing because we keep emitting. Methane, on the other hand, is interesting because while it's in the atmosphere, it's over 100 times more potent at actually warming than a molecule of CO2. However, what's fascinating is that it doesn't stay in the atmosphere forever. It essentially falls out after about 12 years. And so this led to scientists being a little unsure about how to equate the two. And sort of as a relic of some work done in the 90s, everybody decided that all greenhouse gases, let's think of them as their global warming potential over 100 years. And so over 100 years, methane is only about 27 times as potent as CO2. But that's because it's all front loaded. It's only happening in those first 12 years. And so what's interesting about methane is we've got our methane levels in the atmosphere, we're releasing more methane, and the methane from 12 years ago is falling out. And so what I think is so powerful here is that if we focus on methane now and just stop the new emissions, that old stuff falls out. And so you almost get the equivalent of the challenge of carbon sequestration or, carbon removal, but without having to go through, it's not as challenging as carbon removal, but it has the same impact of actually reducing the level of gas in the atmosphere, not just reducing kind of new emissions. And so that was part of the reason that I became so obsessed with this, is I felt that everybody was missing the time value of methane. The most important thing we can do is to buy ourselves more time to deal with these really difficult problems of, electrifying the grid, switching to sustainable energy, figuring out how to do carbon removal. And the best way to buy ourselves more time is stopping new methane emissions, because that kind of directly leads to slowing warming. I think the stat is if we just got rid of all the cows tomorrow or fed them our product, we'd have, about half as much or less warming over the next 25 years. So we would almost buy ourselves an additional couple decades where things are dramatically slowed, almost paused, to work on all these other problems and continue to galvanize, resources and capital and technology towards tackling the rest of the climate issues. So that's why I felt that methane was such an important thing to work on right now. And I also felt guilty about eating steaks. And then sort of the third thing was there's no good reason really why cows produce methane, in terms of it's not an essential part of their digestive process. It's simply it's a way to deal with excess hydrogen that gets produced during fermentation, where all that excess hydrogen gets consumed by these methanogens, these little archaea that occupy the first stomach of the cow. But the methanogens themselves and the methane production is not doing anything valuable for the cow. And in fact, it's a loss of energy, right? Like methane, we know methane is chock full of energy. That's why we burn it in our stoves. And so it's 10 to 15% of the calories a farmer feeds his cow get lost to methane production. And so it's a massive hidden cost for farmers. But they don't see it because there's no way to reduce it right now. And so what that means is you can actually align the incentives here, even without carbon credits, in my view, for a lot of the cows out there, is you can have a product that just makes cows more efficient. And so farmers buy it because it improves their margins. And as a nice side effect, it's a lot better for the planet. So the factor of all of those things, the combination of all of those, of very important problem and being able to align incentives, made me kind of fascinated about this space. And I was really I didn't, start wanting to do a startup. I kind of started I wanted to figure out why this doesn't exist. Why has nobody done this yet? Because it seems doable. And there must be a very good reason why it didn't exist yet. And I assumed that project would take me a week or two to just figure it out, and then I could move on with my life and get a job. And could not find a good answer. And now I'm still here 3 years later. So that's in short my story.
I love that. It's really falling in love with the problem. We hear a lot about founders who build a company because they fell in love with the problem more than the technology.
Or falling in hate with the problem, one of the two.
Oh, hate, maybe.
Just frustrated that it's not solved.
But it also looks like a lot of first principle on your end. Like, there's this problem. I think also not many of us are familiar about it. It's not a useful process for cows. I grew up next to a field full of cows in France and never thought about that wasted energy. So how do you start building a company? I know you went to YC, and I think many people in the audience already also did the same, went to Y Combinator, but maybe there's not that many biotech companies. What was the experience, and how did you find the knowledge or the support system to build a company? How was the experience for you?
Well, I frankly knew just about nothing about startups when beginning this. And so, started doing my own research, and then was saying, it seems like something like this should exist. And I talked to my friends, Caroline and Daria, who were doing their PhDs in chemistry at Berkeley, and just talking to them more and more about, hey, what would a solution to this actually look like? Is it feasible at all? And slowly, they kind of became obsessed with the problem as well. And I said, okay, well, let's see if we can get a little bit of money to prove ourselves wrong, really, and as cheaply as possible. So, you guys can go back to grad school, I can go get a job, and raised like $10,000 at first or $20,000 at first to get a small lab space, do a couple experiments, and showed positive results. And then we got into Y Combinator, and immediately kind of bet 100% of the money that we got, saying we think we have a feed additive that would have large methane reductions. And so spent all of our time producing that feed additive and then doing live animal studies, and kind of spent all of our money doing those live animal studies. And luckily, kind of the day before demo day, we got the results back that we had 97% methane reduction, and that the product did work. And so then we were able to raise, a seed round to actually figure out how to produce it at scale and cheaply, and figure out how to sell it. But
97%.
YC, I think.
I just want to stop and highlight that number because it's huge, and maybe it would be helpful to understand, like, how did you design the feed? What was the iterative process? And you mentioned to me it's a mix of organic and synthetic materials. Because how do you get there? It's so quickly. That's super impressive.
Thank you. Luckily, a lot of the actual ground research had been done already. And so what was fascinating was, and I know people have heard about seaweed for cows for a number of years, and that was largely research done out of Australia, where they identified one special species of red seaweed, Asparagopsis taxiformis, or ATAX, that when added to the feed of cattle had these methane reductions. And so a lot of startups popped up trying to grow ATAX. That's very challenging for a lot of reasons. Like it's an undomesticated species, so it's hard to like actually grow it at the scale or cost that anyone cares about or would make an impact. And then there's also kind of the trouble of you have less control over what actual bioactives are present because you're just growing a seaweed. But you know, the biggest challenge in my eyes is scale there. And so we took the approach of saying, like, I would love to have a kelp farm. Like, I would love to buy a boat with investor money, but it unfortunately doesn't make much economic sense for this startup. And really, the way to have a scalable product here is by taking substrates that are already produced at large scales. In this case, we use other algae that are, you know, grown for other industries already at scale. And so we can buy those cheaply. They're already, you know, harvested at scale, and look at the bioactive profile of them, and compare that to kind of our idealized bioactive profile. And then we can synthesize and stabilize the bioactive compounds that say we need more of, and find a way, and kind of our core IP is synthesizing and stabilizing those compounds and combining them with that raw substrate, so that then you have kind of the right, in our eyes, the idealized bioactive profile.
Very cool. And for those of us who are more on the tech side and more used at A/B testing on the software, how do you do the first testing, and did you partner with farmers? What kind of partners did you have at the beginning?
The first trials and the first, you know, 7 studies before we could actually, you know, begin deploying commercially were all in academic institutions, so college level cows. And so this was like, say, at the University of Kentucky. Can you see this?
Yes.
And so here's how they actually monitor it. Like, this is a cow in a head gas chamber. And so they measure all of the gases that it's producing, hydrogen, methane, CO2. And this is kind of the graph of, you can see this red is not the x-axis. This is our cow after being fed the product. And so this is how they actually measure it for verification in academic studies.
Oh, very impressive. Thank you for sharing the photo.
Yeah, she's our hero, this little cow.
Did you name her?
No, I'm sure they did. I don't know. I wasn't close enough.
So yeah, I think that would be really helpful if you can give us a bit of picture of the industry landscape, right? I think you're talking to beef cattle owners, or also dairy, like yeah, if you can walk us through the complexity of partnering with farmers and what's been your approach, I think it would be super helpful.
Yeah, so there's kind of, it's easy I think a good first distinction is beef versus dairy. And a lot of the other companies in this space have focused on dairy for, you know, very reasonable reasons. Dairy companies are a little bit more vertically integrated, so they have more control over their cows. They often, you know exactly where their milk is coming from, and they are more consumer facing. I don't know the name of that many beef brands, you know, that you buy in the supermarket, but I could name a lot of dairy and yogurt brands and cheese brands. And so they often are a little bit farther ahead on their climate commitments and actually wanting to deploy money here to have projects. On the other hand, we work more with the beef side. And the reason for that is, you know, some of it is just beef animals are a little simpler. Like when we talk about that energy flow, dairy cows, you know, they're taking food in, energy's coming in, they're producing milk, they're also growing, they're often pregnant, so they're also growing a baby. And so there's a lot of different places the energy is flowing, and they live for much longer. They can live six years usually. Whereas beef cattle, especially on the finishing feed yard, it's really simple. It's just all that matters for the farmer is pounds in of feed to pounds out of weight. And they're on the finishing feed yard for 3 to 6 months. And so it's almost like a perfect place to have these pseudo-academic trials, like to A/B test, I guess as you'd say, and much simpler for our target, which is maximizing these efficiency gains. Most of these beef feed yards are, the average cow on a beef feed yard in the US is on a feed yard with like 5 to 10,000 other head. And so the actual cows are fairly concentrated, which makes the sales process easier.
What was the biggest challenge, and did you have to also pivot your messaging a little bit over time to really make the value proposition really clear? Like, how did it work?
Definitely. I go to CattleCon every year. It's the hottest event of the season, and just talk to farmers. First year I went there, I knew absolutely nobody, and the advice I got was I just got kind of bullied by cowboys for 3 days straight. The advice I got was, cut your hair, don't tell people you're from San Francisco, and don't say sustainability. At CattleCon, I think that year, like the hot product everyone was talking about was something that improves feed efficiency by like 2%. So very minimal improvements are massive. And so when I say something like, I think we could get 10%, it's almost like, I don't believe you. Like, I don't even want to talk to you. And so we're actually beginning the first kind of commercial projects when we're going directly to farmers is via carbon credits. And so this is, companies paying for carbon credits. I'm sure everyone's familiar with carbon credits. And the value prop for the farmer is, hey, we'll give you this feed additive for free to try out and see if it, works well on your farm, integrates well with you. And on top of that, we'll give you a cut of the carbon credit revenue. And so that's been a very, it's a fairly attractive value proposition. But really what makes the difference here is consistency. It's a social proof driven industry. The best way you can sell is to have their neighbors using it.
You and I were just chatting a little bit about those carbon credits and
yeah.
with COP29 and a lot of the big discussion. If you don't mind sharing your perspective on where the market is at.
Yeah, so what's interesting is for most of the US, there's not a regulatory carbon credit market. There's somewhat of a cap and trade market in California, but enteric methane or cow projects are not yet approved as a methodology for that market. So what we work in is almost entirely the voluntary carbon credit market. And what we've seen over the years is there's just a crazy range of prices and quality of credits, from $2 a ton of CO2 equivalent for kind of questionable projects around forestry is kind of the stereotype, to super high value $1,000 a ton credits for carbon sequestration, sucking CO2 actually out of the atmosphere. And obviously it shouldn't be that way because a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. But on a voluntary market, you see this super wide spread. And ultimately kind of what determines value on these markets is making sure that these projects would not happen were it not for the carbon credits. That's the additionality, making sure that there's no leakage, like that. And so in our case, making in the logging case, it's, hey, if we promise not to cut down this forest, are we sure that another forest isn't just getting cut down instead? Additionality, leakage, permanence. So if you plant a forest, make sure it doesn't get cut down one day. In our case, if methane doesn't get burped, make sure the cow doesn't burp a bunch more methane later. That's pretty straightforward. So we end up being able to produce pretty high quality carbon credits. But I don't think the top of the market, the $1,000 a ton, I don't see that as a sustainable business model. I think kind of the market's going to converge to about $40 a ton for high quality credits. And it's ultimately not where we want to have the core of our business be. I don't want to build $1 billion business purely on carbon credits, but it's really important catalytic capital for enabling these projects to begin.
We have a question in the chat in the methane. So is there a difference in methane
Yes,
between grass-grazed and grain-fed cattle?
yes. Grass-grazed cattle actually produce more methane, which is fascinating because they're often considered more environmentally friendly because of some of the land management, and potential for soil carbon, but they produce a lot more methane than grain-fed or feed yard cattle. So diet makes a huge impact.
So does that mean the biofeed you're creating has to adjust depending on the regimen of the cows?
Yeah, so we typically, but actually the bigger challenge here is grass-fed cattle. Our product is a feed additive that kind of gets included daily in the feed ration, and a grazing cow isn't, eating we aren't sprinkling this over all the grass. And so we're developing a second product that is like an extended release version of our current product for those grazing cattle.
Very cool. Yeah, I was just curious, like along the way, as I'm sure working on a bio-based product, you have iteration and even scaling discussion. How do you think about the next milestone and how you're going to scale even the production over time?
So actually the production is, we luckily were able to focus on that first. Before, like, we had that from the outset. I think that was a big advantage that we had rather than these original seaweed companies where they were originally focused on like, hey, can we find a seaweed that works and find a way to grow it? And we were focused purely on, like, we need to make a version of a feed additive that is massively scalable. And so we right now are able to work with co-manufacturers for all of our production. And so it's extremely scalable. We can feed a lot of cows.
We have a question from Tuan.
Oh,
What's the general acceptance of farmers about feed additives? Are they generally skeptical or concerned about health implication to the cows? Or are they pretty open to as long as the efficiency is proven?
I would say like they use a lot of feed additives, but they're absolutely risk averse and skeptical, and rightly so. They're in a very thin margin business, sometimes a negative margin business, depending on the year. And so they want to see something proven out, usually more than just academically. They want to see it actually done in commercial settings. And they also have nutritionists, PhDs in animal health and animal science who review all of that data for them before they actually get the okay to deploy it. So the composition of the product, what it actually looks like is kind of a green brown powdered seaweed. And the composition is kind of that seaweed combined with the bioactives that we synthesize ourselves that are not produced in the seaweed, or modifications we have to make to the seaweed after it's been harvested, whether that's reducing or increasing the levels of different bioactives.
Is there any difference in both effectiveness and in health implications for different breeds?
Yes, there is. Dairy cows produce more methane. The biggest difference is really from diet and size than breed. But there are differences between breeds, and we see, for dairy cows, we have to use a slightly higher dose.
Yeah, I was actually asking, between different, there's different breeds even within beef cattle and dairy cattle, but yes,
Yes.
the breeds are significantly more different between dairy cattle and beef cattle than within them. That's true.
Yes.
You mentioned that there's the methane aspect of the cows, but then there's also the land use aspect of cows from the environmental. And I would just love to hear your views on this, because sometimes I worry that if I reduce the externalities of cows for methane, it'll show up that we're just going to have more cows having worse outcomes for land use and animal cruelty. And I was wondering how you've navigated that conundrum for yourself.
Yeah, what is it? It's like Jevons paradox. I looked into this a fair bit, and I was just looking at particularly the response to price for beef and dairy, and I think for the level of efficiency improvements you would see, the benefits really far outweigh any increase in demand. And that demand elasticity is not super price sensitive, at least for beef and dairy. But an interesting thing is, if anything, okay, so there's a whole lot of things that are problematic about cows in general, right? There's methane, there are humanitarian concerns, and there are also land use concerns. And we've gotten this from investors before who say, we're actually not interested in anything that supports or gives more fuel to the current system. We're only interested in plant-based meat or cell-based meat. And I kind of disagree with this view, not just because of my company, but I think also generally because the land-based land use problem, we're actually seeing more and more countries shift more towards concentrated feed yards, feed operations, even though that's more expensive on the feed side. You're seeing more of a shift there as some of those externalities get plugged. Land becomes more expensive. You see higher concentration, better product. And if anything, products that improve efficiency encourage that shift. So I think that is a net positive, really, to have slightly more concentrated operations in a lot of countries. We're seeing that, especially in Brazil, an increase in concentration. But I think my bigger point is, or my bigger view on this is, we often think just about the US and our beef and dairy consumption here, where we do have alternatives. But what's really interesting is the developing countries, where as incomes are increasing, there's just more of a demand for red meat and cheese and dairy. And those are much larger emitters of methane than the US. And I think we don't have time to wait for, I hope cell-based meat wins in the end, but I don't think we have time for that. That's not happening anytime soon. And we can't wait for that to happen to address all of these emissions across the globe.
Since you launched the company, have you seen competitors coming in the space? Because you kind of demonstrated it was feasible. What's the industry like today?
So many more competitors than when we started. When we started, it was just us and those seaweed companies. And now it's often like, folks, I almost feel like we need to rebrand, because Alga Biosciences, a lot of times investors or customers think we're one of those seaweed companies with really high prices and low supply. But it is good. I think one thing that's been interesting is the development of approaches for situations that we can't currently tackle easily, particularly vaccines. When I talk to these other companies, we really see this as, it's not going to be a winner-take-all market. There's a lot of way to segment all the cows in the world, and there isn't a product that's a perfect fit for all of them. And so, for example, a place like India that has a lot of small owners of farms, small owners of cattle, or they own a couple cattle, there's no real way economically where we can fit in there. And so you're going to need an approach like a vaccine. A lot of these can also stack, we're hoping, to provide greater methane reductions for lower cost. And so I think in general, the increased attention on this market is going to be a good thing. We just need to make sure this gets reflected in speed of deployment.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I was just curious, as a founder, where do you spend your time? Because obviously you had a big ramp up, understanding an industry, developing a brand new product, and now scaling. How you think about growth and your time and where you want to position your team?
I feel like my job changes every month, which is fun and like odd. But always talking to investors. I'm doing a lot of commercial work, but also just making sure that our R&D department is kind of working in tandem with our commercial department, because it's very easy for those to kind of drift apart and be on separate trajectories, and constantly kind of reevaluating. It's just so different than academic research in terms of timelines and deliverables. that it's been kind of an interesting experience learning how to do that at the speed necessary and shift what we need, whether that's the kind of the in vitro cow bottles and stomachs that we've got, or right now we're doing much more work on the data science now that we have so many data points to build a better model of the cow rumen. Terry, I saw your question. Palatability is what they call it in the industry, and it's absolutely a thing. They test that. If the cows don't like the taste of it, dairy cows in particular are pretty picky. So if they don't like the taste of it, it's not going to work.
Practically, is there any tips or way of working that you've developed to make sure the sales team and the R&D team are really connected? We love hearing sometimes the practical thing people put in place, just that other people can get inspired from.
That's a good, I don't know if I have anything particularly unique, except for the R&D team is very involved in commercial deployments, of actually seeing the cows. And this is in large part because we use our commercial stuff to feed more data back into our R&D team, but actually having that hands on the ground experience and all of these things that are, feeding into the development of the product that has fed these cows is constantly being iterated upon. So in some ways, what is being deployed at a commercial setting is a conversation we have with the R&D team as well. And so we try to move kind of as one organism, even though R&D will have a lot of things going on in the background.
And the data science aspect is working through the farmers, or do you also have your own way of collecting data in the field?
Both.
Okay.
So we both get data from the farmers and collect our own data on the field.
Name, Alga Biosciences. A bit earlier, you talked about CattleCon, and I think the learning that you have there and the advice there is extremely valuable about how to frame the discussion and not identify yourself as a sustainability product, etc. And I think for me, intuitively, that's a very hard thing to do when I'm talking to people about energy and climate. But I think what you've done is super important, especially given sort of the landscape of the next 2-4 years. And I'm curious if you have any additional sort of like, how do you do it? Like, how do you sit there and not talk about these things to people? And any advice for others who are in the climate space there?
I mean, I think, all right, I'll start with something kind of cliche that I found to be true, and then maybe it'll lead to something more useful. But like really getting to know your customers in terms of really getting to know your producers. I didn't grow up on a feed yard or with dairy cows, so I didn't know my customers very well. And what was really interesting to me is that it's not that these guys don't care about sustainability. In some sense, they can't afford to take a cut of their profit to produce more sustainable cattle because they would just go out of business. Sure, but they also feel unfairly villainized in the climate debate. And so they have, I think there's often kind of the sense that, liberals are trying to pin the carbon problem on them, when in actuality, hey, we've had cows for, thousands of years. We had buffalo before. There have been ruminants burping methane here in North America for a very long time. And these cows have actually just gotten more efficient over the last 50 years. Their carbon intensity is lower than it used to be. And so they don't want to feel like they're unfairly villainized here. And in actuality, I think they talk a lot about conservation. Particularly these ranches have been handed down for generations. And so like one of the most fun parts of CattleCon is the yearly kind of conservation award, which ranch wins that. And so they do care a lot about kind of land stewardship, land ownership, and having kind of a place, having a sustainable system. And so what is fascinating is like this conversation around farmers as climate heroes. It's not something that I think that's something they're very interested in. And like, that's something that we need to make a place for them to be there. Kind of changing the narrative around that has been really fascinating in our conversations. And there's just this massive gap in communication between the climate community and the actual producers on the ground. that really has to be bridged, because our incentives are aligned here. Like,
Yeah.
I keep talking about that, but even without the efficiency stuff, our incentives are aligned to have a better planet. And they could be the most significant source of climate mitigation of the next 30 years. And I think that's a role that they'd be very excited to play.
I know we're getting close to the end of our time together. Just wanted to ask, for you personally, what does success look like? And if we talk again in 2 or 3 years, where do you hope the company will be at that time?
I mean, for us, we said from the start, since before we got any money, like, success for this company is feeding hundreds of millions, reducing the methane from hundreds of millions of cattle. And I still believe that. Like, that is what success looks like. Otherwise, it's a fairly small contribution. And so that's what we're aiming for.
100 of millions. It's a good goal. And how can this community help you? You have a lot of talent here
Yes.
with background and people and connections, awareness. Like, how can we be helpful to you?
That is a great question. If any of you guys own cattle, let's talk. If any of you guys own, food brands that buy beef or dairy, let's talk, or have connections there. I think we'll be doing some hiring soon on, particularly, I assume this is a community very technically skilled. And so we're doing some hiring around data science. Don't have to have a background particularly in cow data science, but microbiology data science, that area, be really interesting to talk.
Alex,
I have one quick question. Just
Yeah.
now that you're 3 years in and you've learned all that you have learned, do you have any sense of like why it hasn't been done? Like, why aren't the big feed distributors just adding your bioactives into their own feed?
A couple of reasons. The first is it's slow sales cycle, and a lot of our customers are still fairly early on in how they're thinking about this. And what it takes is a couple deployments of proving out these efficiency gains before all of a sudden you can transition to just very, very, very rapid sales. And each of those deployments takes 6 months. And so that sales cycle is slow. But I'm happy to say that I don't think there are any technological barriers holding it back anymore. There's a lot to be done on the tech side of maximizing efficiency gains, but on the methane, that's solved. That just requires deployment. But there's still a whole world of efficiency and microbiome maximization to be done.
thank you so much, Alex, for your time. I think it was so enlightening and also so positive. I think these days we can't have too many positive news about what's happening. And a topic we talk a lot in this group is about designing better solutions that can really attract desire, whether it's a heat pump that looks really nice, whether it's a solution that makes sense economically. Like, we know those things need to stand on their own 2 feet and to be really impactful and grow adoption. So again, thank you so much. Please let us know how we can help.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your time today. I hope I'll see you in 2 weeks for our next episode.